Okay, welcome to the James Gurney Sketchbook Tour at Proko's 12 Days of Christmas. I'm going to take you through 3 sketchbooks today. The first is a study book from 1985, and the second is a more recent gouache sketchbook. So these are mostly paintings in a watercolor sketchbook. Then I want to show you a book that is being republished from a 1982 edition called The Artist's Guide to Sketching. This is the first copy. I just got this a day or two ago. So let's start out talking about the study book. If you look up here, there's a link to James Gurney's Self-Education Journey, which is an interview I did with Proko and Marshall Vandroff about how do you teach yourself art and how I approached that when I was a dropout from art school, when I taught myself by reading and taking notes. This is the notebook I was taking it in 1985. So I was about 27 years old, something like that. One of my heroes was Dean Cornwell. And what I like about Dean Cornwell is the way he stylized the forms. So he used straight against curves. He used the light modeling on the light side against a much more bold dark modeling on the shadow side. So whenever I had a thought like that, I would write it in the margin of the book to remind myself what to look for. This is a painting he did for a life insurance calendar in 1953 about the founding of New York. And what I wanted to get was just the essence of the figures in this colonial American scene with all these guys reading. There are 32 figures in there, but I just wanted to use a soft pencil, probably a 2B or a 3B, to get the main dark shapes. These are other small thumbnail sketches, mainly from reproductions, so you can go through art books or from art museums. This is Samuel Nelson Abbott, Dean Cornwell. Here with the Dean Cornwell, just a big 4B soft graphite pencil to get the essential dark shapes. And Cornwell was so bold at having a big dark shape with just the figure coming out of the edge of the dark shape. I think that's what I was most interested in at this point in my learning path, was how do you simplify in light and dark masses to keep it simple? Here's a painting by Leon Bonnat, a French academician, with one of the notes I have is that the significant forms are in the half light. The strong leg muscles tensing as he pulls back the mouth of the lion. This is the youth of Samson when he was fighting lions. Here's one, Edward J. Pointer, a historical scene of the catapult. I love the way he had this big, soft, dark area, a couple figures in here. Frank Bramley, Hopeless Dawn, a famous painting from the Tate Museum, one of Napoleon crossing the Alps. Here's a seascape by N.C. Wyeth, really bold shapes, not at all naturalistic. He was really caricaturing the shapes. This is a statue of Augustus St. Gaudens, paintings by Caravaggio. I love the way Caravaggio divided his scenes into light shapes and dark shapes. So this one of St. Jerome in Meditation from 1606, he has all the light forms, the wrinkles in the belly, real simple darks. So when I would go to an art museum like the Metropolitan Museum, I would sketch Juan de Pareja by Velázquez with just a quick line study. This is Cormon, who was another French academician. The family of Cain, so a biblical story, Alma Tadema. So these are our thumbnail sketches. This is A Sinking Ship by Carl Evers. Now if a composition will read this with this simple of an analysis, you know it's a good study. So when I was thumbnailing my compositions later for my illustration assignments, I would kind of try to return to this type of thinking. This is F.R. Gruger, who's an illustrator for the illustrated magazines in America. And he worked mainly out of his head, so he's really good at composing complex scenes. J.M.W. Turner. Some of these are just really quick. This is an analysis of Arthur Rackham's compositions. N.C. Wyeth's self-portrait, and one of his Treasure Island illustrations. So whatever you find that moves you or that inspires you, you can do a thumbnail sketch of it. Some of these were done at the Brandywine River Museum. And also reading notes. Whenever you read something about old masters or how they worked or how they thought about their work, I found it really helped to write down some notes. So I like the Victorians, the French academics, and the American Golden Age illustrators the most. Read about William Tross Richards, who is an American landscape painter, Edwin Austin Abbey, This is my wife, Jeanette, who was making dinner, so I took a little break while she was cooking supper. I like doing people who are actually doing a job or moving around rather than a posed model, because you never know how long they'll hold a pose. I read about Howard Pyle's teaching. Howard Pyle was founder of the Pyle School. N.C. Wyeth, Maxwell Parrish, Frank Schoonover, Stanley Arthurs all studied under him. Here's one, a quote from Andrew Loomis. You probably know about Loomis's books from Proko. He said, "The dawning of a truth comes with its actual application, not the day it is heard." So if you learn something, it's when you put it to use that you really learn it. So some of these are just notes from when this is my wife while we were listening to the radio. Frank Brangwyn. I'll skip ahead a little bit because a lot of these are just written notes. This is the first sketch for Waterfall City. It kind of led to Dinotopia. This is 1985, so I was real early on when I was thinking about a fantasy city built on a waterfall. These are the very first sketches for it. And I go through a lot of sketches like this, thinking about what I was looking at from these reproductions to generating things from my own imagination, try to apply some of the same ideas. But one thing that Howard Pyle emphasized was the importance of doing lots and lots of sketches before you really know what you want. I sent a couple of my samples off to Tom Lovell, who's an illustrator I admired. He did a lot of stuff for the illustrated magazines and for National Geographic. And he gave me some really helpful critiques that I wrote down. Dean Cornwell, again, was wonderful in his vignette illustrations. He had a different approach than anyone else. He would call it the telegram of illustration. What he meant was these were really the essential story elements of the figures against the background, and he would make it look like a torn piece of paper torn out of a larger composition. This is Joaquin Sorolla, a Spanish painter who did the regions of Spain at the Hispanic Society in New York City. And another Dean Cornwell composition. His work really evolved over time. I'm a real believer in self-teaching, and some of my favorite artists are self-taught, like Alphonse Menzel or Mort Drucker, the Mad Magazine cartoonist, was self-taught. So you can really learn a combination of reading, going to museums, sketching what you see. This is a concert that I went to with a big organ. And you can do your sketches in your book like this in ballpoint pen like this is, or in marker, or in pencil. This is Henryk Symoracki, I think he's a Polish-Russian artist who did Phryne at the Festival of Poseidon, where she took off her clothes and blew everyone's minds, wandered into the sea. I love the way he organized all these figures, a lot of figures in this scene.
I had a friend tell me that artists are always learning, so there's never really a chance to completely master the craft. So is there any kind of new techniques that you've learned that you're excited about and you use in your sketches recently?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always learning, and I think that's one of the things about whether you go to art school or not, or teach yourself. It's a lifetime journey, and I love combining media, ballpoint pen or fountain pen, colored pencil, watercolor, gouache, casein. Any of those water media you can combine on a page. Sometimes I'll do, if you look at my videos, I do a priming color in casein. And that's nice because the casein won't be disturbed by wet layers of gouache later. So you can do a casein layer and then build that up in gouache. That's why sometimes I don't like calling it traditional media, because that's anything but traditional. Nobody's done that before, I don't think. It's just more like analog or more physical media as opposed to digital. Sometimes I'll do a line drawing with a fountain pen that's got a reddish brown ink. If I wet that down, it'll dissolve and look like rust. So I do that sometimes. So you can just experiment with any combination of these things. I might get back into markers again after doing this book, because markers are really nice. It really gives you a nice flat value. This is a gouache sketchbook. It's actually a watercolor sketchbook made by Pentel. I always give a title on each sketchbook. It's usually the first line in the sketchbook. So in this case, I wrote honey and gathering, meaning my wife was going to the supermarket shopping, and I was sitting in the parking lot while she's doing that. What I was interested in was the setting sun and the way it sort of diffused across these silhouettes. This is casein and gouache and a little bit of pastel. Greg Ruth is a great illustrator from life when he was doing a critique at the illustration master class. And I love the way his head has this upward shaped triangle kind of. So he didn't mind me doing a caricature of him at all. When someone's talking, I love to write down word for word what they say. Like he says, he's built for battle. He was just talking about a student's composition. He's constantly off balance. He's a luck fighter. And then Ken Williams was looking at another one, saying you can bring some of those warm tones down to the foreground. So I did a little demo at this gathering from a Waterfall City maquette. This is what that looked like. I also love to paint animals from life. This is a gouache study of a draft horse while it was getting washed down and the mane was being bleached for the county fair. So each one of these figures was going through a lot of different poses. So I had to pick a moment to portray them. This one is washing the fat locks, and this one had a foamy sponge on its back. And this guy was just holding the horse. So the horse obviously doesn't pose, it moves a lot, but that makes it a lot more fun for me. I wanted to try to paint the most ordinary, unloved corner of the world, and that was this edge of a parking lot in Kingston, New York, with trash on the ground and weeds here and cracking asphalt. Here's a bridge going across the Delaware River. I was waiting for my son to come down the river on his floating air mattress. And this one, I did this landscape and thought it was kind of boring, so I stuck Super Mario in there. But to make him look really huge, I kind of made the colors pale to make it look like it's super far away. Here's a portrait that I did in an Irish pub of Mick Maloney, who's since passed. Wonderful singer, banjo player, Irish musician. And he was lit by this light that was on the wall above him. And he was moving, of course, and singing and changing poses a lot, but it's fun to do his portrait there. Here's Dylan Foley, a young friend of mine who's a fiddle champion. He's American, but he's won the All-Ireland competition in every age category. I think he's the only one to have done that. So while he was playing music, my son was also in the band he played in. I wanted to kind of try to capture him, and his hand was in such a blur that I didn't even try to freeze it in the pose. Kind of carrying on with my theme of looking for the most ordinary subjects possible. This is just the back of a VW dealer next to the supermarket where I painted a lot of my studies. Another draft horse at the farm. Some cows at the county fair. This is ground driving, where how you harness up a draft horse and walk behind it and you can steer. They let me try that, which is really fun. This is at a county fair blacksmith competition. These are farriers who make horseshoes. They had a certain amount of time to make a horseshoe for competition. So again, I was probably influenced by the idea of photography of blurring the action, because they're moving so much anyway, you can't really freeze it with your eyes. This is the idea of sitting at a bench near a busy street corner and painting people in silhouette. Try to get the essential silhouette first and a middle value, and then punching a few darks. And you can really get a lot of detail that way.
I'm currently working through your gouache series, the Gouache in the Wild, and your gouache portraits. Do you have any suggestions for handling edges and transitions?
Okay, in gouache, it's really perfect for building from the background to the foreground, especially if you want hard edges around everything. So you can overlap things. You can paint over a sky. You can paint a tree over a sky and build your way forward from background to foreground. But sometimes you do want soft edges. And the nice thing about gouache is it stays active even after it dries. So you can go in with a wet brush and soften an edge later with acrylic or even casein, which is sort of halfway between acrylic and gouache. It's a little harder to do that. When you're doing a figure against the background, it's nice to have the ability to soften edges, because the tendency, I think, is to make everything too crisp and tight in a painting, and it's nice to have a range of edges. A lot of my friends travel to Europe or south of France or Italy to do their workshops, but I really like just completely ordinary street side scenes. Probably no one wants to go to Elizabeth, New Jersey for a workshop, but this one happens to be Kingston, New York. But I love just this tangle of wires and poles. This is in Maine, a busy main street in Damariscotta. And along the coast, using a fairly limited palette, there's a YouTube video where I talk about realism and abstraction and how when you do a realist painting, especially of a seascape, you have to think in abstract terms anyway, even if you're trying to make a realistic capture. This is David Rockwell, who is the nephew of Betsy Wyeth, who was at the Wyeth Museum at the Olson House, talking about his memories of Andrew Wyeth. So while he was talking, I was doing a portrait of him. And he got a big kick out of that. I always try to get the person, if I do a painting of a subject, to get them to sign the sketch afterwards. Here's a wooden boat shop in Maine with an old boat that was parked out front of the shop, and then a dock where they were unloading lobsters. So this dock rose up during the 2 or 3 hours I did this sketch. So everything is moving here. I thought it was a fairly static scene, but it's very dynamic, it turns out. And then I find cell towers really interesting to sketch because everyone hates them, and I find them kind of cool to look at. Looks like something from outer space that landed on the Earth. And then this one is just an alleyway in Greenwich, New York, with a couple of cars parked there, a bunch of cigarette butts, which I didn't sketch in.
Would love to know one of your favorite memories or encounters that you've captured while sketching on location.
Oh, okay. Favorite encounters. I was doing some sketches of some sheep in a farmer's field. So I did this sheep and this chicken head, but they moved, so I didn't do the rest of their body. So I was kind of bummed out by that. I went to a pub that night, and I sat there, and I was looking across at this guy drinking beer with his wife, and he was right in the same position as that sheep head. So I drew his shoulders and his body, and his wife became the chicken-headed lady, and it really worked out perfect. But then he got up to go walk by me to go to the bathroom. He looked at me and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Oh, I just drawing a picture." "Is that me?" I said, "Well, it's sort of you." And he kind of looked really disturbed, came out of the bathroom, sat down at his table, pushed the beer away, and never took another sip that night.
How would you tackle drawing complicated subjects like oil refineries that have a bunch of little lines in perspective?
Yeah, that's a good question. To get a bunch of lines in perspective, often there's a vanishing point that's way off of the page. What I would do for that one is set up a perspective grid, which means you look for the highest line that you can really measure, draw that one on the page, draw the horizontal eye level, and then you can break that up into intermediate measurement on each side. Then once you have that, it's called a grid, once you have that on the page in light pencil, then when you're drawing all the little details, if there's windows or pipes or whatever, they'll all fall within that grid. You just drop them in and you got it.
If perspective is a tricky subject for you, then let Marshall shed some light on it for you. Find the answers at proko.com/perspective.
A lot of the inspiration for sketching came when I was an art school dropout from Art Center. I went there for 2 semesters, met my wife, we were sketching buddies. Tom Kincaid and I were friends. This is the same Thomas Kincaid who later became the painter of light. But back when I knew him, he was a painter of like gritty urban scenes and street people. And what we did was we decided to drop out of school and ride the freight trains across America. We met this hobo named Bud who told us how to ride the freights. If you want to learn more about the book, here's a QR code. This book was really our story of our adventure, riding the freight trains, hitchhiking, sleeping in graveyards, on rooftops. We slept on top of like this hay truck that we thought would stay still. When this book was published in 1982, it was all in black and white. So when we wanted to bring it back into print, it's coming out in February 25th of 2025. We wanted to keep everything the same. I just wrote a new introduction about how this book came to be. And we included some pieces of art from the same period that haven't been published before. Like this is one of Thomas Kincaid posing for me as a starving artist. And this is one where I went into a barber shop and I did one of the barber and the guy getting the haircut, kind of exaggerating them a little bit, having some fun with it. So there's a bit of artwork that wasn't published before in this book, but everything else we want to keep the same. The story of riding the freight trains, and at the time in 1982, there really wasn't many people talking about sketching. When we went into the publishers at Watson Guptill originally, we told them about this crazy idea. We were wearing uniform shirts that we had made up specially with our name, Jim and Tom. With gas station shirts, we got like short haircuts. They thought we were completely insane because we weren't even sleeping in hotels. We were sleeping on piers or on rooftops to just try to save money. There's a scene in Brooklyn that Tom Kincaid drew. So this is kind of a different side. This is another one by Tom. Different side of him than you've probably seen, because you probably think of him as the glowing cottages. All that came much later. He was really the bohemian artist. I sat on the landing area of a helicopter landing port for the police helicopters in Glendale. They let me sit right next to the airfield, but I didn't realize when they would land, the prop wash would blow all my paper away. So it's kind of crazy. Went into like people playing video games, a movie set. the reason we liked sketching is it took us on this adventure. All the material, we used a lot of markers, and a lot of the sketches in this book were originally printed in black and white, but a lot of them were really done in gray. This is me and Tom back then. And places in Long Beach have since disappeared, so it's kind of a lost America too. But one of the things we really emphasize in this book, and I really encourage you to do, is you don't have to draw exactly what you see. So this antique store, when I was looking at it, there was nothing out here. So I tried to imagine some of the stuff that was inside, taken outside, all the furniture, and I made up signs, and you don't have to draw exactly what you see at all. There's a bit about perspective. I know a lot of the ateliers, trained students really are good at capturing exactly what they see. And I sometimes I get into that mode too, where I just want to be like a human camera. And I have a grid system and a Renaissance style viewer scope that I'll probably talk about in a future video. Plus I use, the measurements and all that. But when you think about what the academic painters were really doing, they were doing storytelling paintings. So they were really interested in how to tell a story, how to be dramatic. And that meant, going beyond the model. And in the actual French academies, you would definitely get criticized for being too literal. And usually the models were posing with some kind of story in mind. And what those artists were really trained to do was in fact, what they did to win the Prix de Rome, which is the prize that would send a graduate to Rome, is they would have to go in a locked room if they got to this qualifying entrance, like a study stall. They'd read the prompt for the story. They'd have to know all these stories from classical literature, from the Bible, classical history, whatever it was, and they'd have to do a thumbnail sketch, and then in the final painting, they have to stick to that sketch. But I really admired that. And doing studies like in a book like this, I was interested in trying to understand how they would think. I'm a real believer in going back and reading as much as you can about the thinking of artists that you admire from the past. It's one thing to say, I'm the great-great-grand student of so-and-so, but that's only as good as the weakest link. You're much better off, I think, going to the source, finding out how they thought, how they worked. People like John William Waterhouse, Edwin Austin Abbey, or John Singer Sargent, who also had a lot of imagination in his portraits, a lot of caricature. There's always room to heighten reality in a painting. If you're inclined to imagination, you can really deliver that. And I think that's one thing that's great about Lightbox Expo, is that the artists here are mostly somewhere on that spectrum between observational realism and pure imagination. And the magic happens in between those two poles. But I want to show you just in particular one chapter two chapters, one about capturing motion. This is something that we all deal with when we're dealing with any subject where they're moving a lot. If it's a cyclical motion, like someone bowling, you can kind of capture some key frames from one pose to the next, one moment to the next, but you have to be able to capture that phase of action in your memory, short-term memory, to be able to draw it. So it takes both knowledge and memory in addition to observation. And those are the skills that you kind of have to train yourself. Like if you're doing an animal, a tiger walking around an enclosure in a zoo, a lot of animals have cage behaviors where they repeat what they're doing, and that really helps. The scribble approach, gestural approach, these are different ways of capturing motion. We went to a boxing match in LA, and what I tried was an idea I call the tonal mass approach, where you take a rag impregnated with charcoal and rub it in the basic action that these guys got into a couple times, and then add detail later. This thing about mood, a whole chapter on mood, how to give something a feeling of nostalgia or mood.
How did you learn to draw moving subjects?
Just practice. I mean, how to draw moving subjects. The key for me is just to try to hold something in a short-term memory. I normally love to look at something that's holding fairly still, but obviously if you're painting someone walking or moving, you have to remember. So I tried this idea I call the flash glance method, where you follow them along and then close your eyes at the point you want to remember. After image will stay on your retina for a little, like a second or two. You can often build off that. So before photography, that's what people had to do. That's one of the reasons why horse paintings from before photography aren't as good as the ones done later, because they didn't really know whether they would put all front feet forward, back feet back on a gallop, or whether there was something else going on until they got Muybridge and some of the other artists he worked with set up cameras to really see what phases of action, really fast action they were doing. And that revolutionized the whole process. I would also say that the Disney studios, Art Babbitt was one of the animators who set up a school for studying action and movement and how do you capture that. And Don Graham was one of the teachers there. They kind of analyzed, they would have models who take a one keyframe pose and then they move to another keyframe. And then the animators would study them from one pose to another. When they were working on Bambi, they had live animals like deer and rabbits. But when they found that it was just impossible to capture them, so they ended up relying a lot on photography. But the chapter I also want to show you is imagination. This idea where I could just take a stump and give him a face. I was inspired, of course, by Arthur Rackham and some of the artists of the 19th century. Or in the Air and Space Museum, I set up and did a pen and ink drawing of this airplane, but made it the ultimate airplane. And there were a bunch of kids that hung out next to me and they gave me ideas for what to do for the landing gear, put cars down there for the landing gear and a bicycle. And so you don't have to draw exactly what you see. For those of you who like imagination, you can do surrealistic combinations of things. Like I started this sketch of this merry-go-round and added it to a fishing harbor. This was a psychology professor of mine in college. I went to UC Berkeley first before Art Center, and he was talking about aggression and how humans are all really aggressive, so I made him into a monster. Or a giant hand coming out of the water. Or this is a fun one for animators, where you see like a museum of, let's say, cars or trains, where I was sitting here, and I wanted to make them like they're made of rubber. I was inspired by the old Disney animators, to make them look like they're rearing up or inflating with air, as if they're made of some kind of flexible material. But what's nice about being on location is you can crawl underneath them and look at them from below and see what's going on underneath the structure of the car. And it'd be harder to do that if you're working from reference. Or this was sitting in the Coney Island looking at the Spookorama ride, the guy selling tickets. So I imagined 4 little goblins there getting their tickets. So anyway, this book is a lot of fun. We reshot all the artwork from the original, including like this one of the frog that painted in gouache and pencil. It's published by Andrews McNeil, and I'm really excited that this is coming back into print again.
When you're painting and drawing, how do you warm up? Do you start with sketches or do you start painting, or do you just jump right into it?
Well, when I'm on the spot, sometimes I just dive right in with a brush. But I usually, even on location, I'll start with a pencil drawing or a colored pencil drawing. And when I'm in the studio doing like illustrations of dinosaurs or for Dinotopia or National Geographic or whatever, I start with lots and lots of sketches. The more the better. I mean, quick ones. That's what all the great illustrators used to do, is lots and lots of thumbnail sketches. And that gives you, just even if you start out thinking, this is it, I got it right off the bat in a thumbnail sketch. If you do 50 more or 49 more, you'll know for sure that really is the best, but chances are it's not. Like my Waterfall City ideas probably went through maybe 50 or 100 different sketches before I got to where I was happy. So you have to be very relentless at just generating lots of ideas. And I would suggest switching from pencil to pen and ink wash to little painted sketches. But change the media around. Maybe use digital if you're comfortable with that. So that you can really try out different ideas.
I noticed that you do a lot of sculpting. I thought it was really cool. Where did you learn to do all your sculpting and your 3D?
Questions about sculpting 3D maquettes for reference. And they could be anything from a real rough, quick sculpt out of modeling clay that I just use again for something else, to a pretty detailed little study in, I often use Magic Sculpt, which is a 2-part epoxy. Or Sculpey, which is an oven hardening clay. You probably use that. And it really, really helps, especially for cast shadows and light and shade. Because what makes realism convincing in an imaginary subject like a dinosaur or an ancient scene is when you get the lighting right. If you get the lighting right, the viewer will accept it as reality. But the only way to get that, I find, is by making a 3D sculpt or a maquette. Like, for example, I had one of a Titanoboa, which is a giant snake from South America, strangling an alligator. And so I found a few videos online, but they mostly happen underwater, so you really can't see these caiman alligator giant anaconda fights. But so I had to sculpt it. But I had the hand of the alligator, like as he's dying up here. But there was a cast shadow on my maquette. Went from his hand onto the snake. I never would have dreamed of doing that. But by having the 3D sculpt, I could really see it right in front of me. And you can turn it around and get just what the angles you want. But I find that even if you're not much of a sculptor or you haven't done much time, if you got, let's say, 3 days to do a picture, you spend the first half day doing a sculpt, you'll be much better off. If you're doing architecture or you want something with the straight lines, you can use cardboard or foam core board, glue gun or white glue to glue together a little 3D model. Doesn't need to be very detailed. You can either paint it white, gray, or full color. You can spray paint it a matte gray with a matte like primer. And then it photographs a little bit better if it's gray instead of white. If it's white, it tends to burn out a little too much.
I wanted to ask you, what's your favorite dinosaur?
Favorite dinosaur? Well, I do like the Microraptor, which is that 4-winged dinosaur. And I love the fact that they've found some feathers on some of the specimens. They can even tell what coloration it was. It probably looked like a crow with a red crest. I also like the Stegosaurus. Both of those, the reason I like them is they're such unlikely designs. If someone was designing them from scratch, it would never make sense to have wings on the front and back legs or having these plates on the back. Like, that's crazy. What are those for? So I love the way nature comes up with ideas that we never would have dreamed up as concept artists. And that's one of the things about dinosaurs that's so cool, is that we know they existed. We can see their evidence in the ground, but we don't really see them until we actually imagine them and draw them out or paint them. And that's why paleontologists are really nice to artists, because they know that they need us to visualize their scientific discoveries.
Hey, thanks for watching, everybody. If you want to see another video in this series by my friend Marshall Vandruff, who's exactly my age and has a better voice, check out proko.com/perspective.